thank you all for being here and for taking the time to learn more about Larry and his new book, A New Age of Reason, Harnessing the Power of Tech for Good. So I am Amanda Keane. I'm a storyteller at heart, and God, I love a good conversation. I'm also a vice president at Racepoint Global, an integrated communications agency that was founded by Larry Weber. So let me make some quick introductions for our guests, each with an inspirational journey with technology. Many of us know David Kirkpatrick as an esteemed journalist who worked at Fortune for over 40 years. He also created Fortune's Brainstorm Conference, which he founded on his belief in the power of technology as a critical rule for improving the world. David is devoted to explaining and understanding the intersection of technology and progress. He's the founder of Techonomy, a community and nexus for business leaders to intersect with tech innovators and learn how to be better technologists. And today, David is working on his new book on climate tech and the climate economy. Dr. Alexander Dale is an interdisciplinary specialist with an eye for creative solutions and a passion for sustainability. Currently the director of global challenges at MIT Solve, Alexander's work spans from electricity to engineering to education, as well as overseeing MIT Solve's annual challenges on society, environmental and healthcare, as well as advocacy for Indigenous communities. So welcome to you both. Those are lofty bios. Does he even need an introduction? Larry? We just go with one name. For over 45 years, Larry has witnessed, experienced, and embraced the gifts that technology provides. And I'm pretty sure I can say you have all been inspired with his storytelling and understanding of what technology can do. And if you have yet to be inspired, please buy the book and read it. As I was thinking ahead for this conversation, I kept coming back to the fact that what we do now makes a difference, yet ultimately it impacts the generations to come. It also made me think of my daughter Ella. She's 5. On our recent camping trip to Ireland, by the way, camping Ireland, just think twice about that. Ella was indignant about the fact that she was in a house, in reality it was actually a tent, that did not have Wi-Fi. And she said, "Mom, who builds a house without Wi-Fi?" So think about that. Technology has become the forefront of problem solving, creating solutions for even the most challenging hurdles. In Ella's case, it was a way for her to experience the world of unicorns and get time away from her brothers. Another young mind, one of our interns at Racepoint Global, wrote the following: "If innovation and curiosity had a love child, its name would be technology." So as a self-proclaimed techno-optimist, Larry, what ignited your spark to write this book?
Well, this is my 7th book, and half of them nobody read, but the other half people read. And I was determined not to write a marketing book this time. Even though there's a lot of marketers in the room. And if you do read the book, think of the Zen of marketing, because I think that that's what I tried to put in here. But the reason I wrote this book is I remember studying the original Age of Reason, and it kept bouncing in my head as I kept reading reports that, AI was going to take people's jobs away, and technology is a bad thing and it's an evil thing, and there needs to be guardrails and there needs to be all this discipline around these things. And I said, I've spent over 4 decades with entrepreneurs, innovative companies, from Lotus to Pega to LinkedIn to HTML. When Tim Berners-Lee, when it was in our office in Cambridge, and Tim goes, "I'm calling it the World Wide Web. Do you think that's catchy?" And I'm like, hey, and I kept going. Also, then when I was talking with one of my adult children, and they said, God, Dad, what do you think about this new technology, AI? And I said, well, I think Alan Turing wrote a paper on it in 1948, and started thinking about that. Then I told the story about Nicholas Negroponte introducing me, when we represented the Media Lab, introducing me to two guys, one named Marvin Minsky and one named Seymour Papert. And they were working on AI. And of course, it wasn't baked enough yet, but it started getting me thinking that, and another technology came into mind with the Bakers, a couple that had started voice recognition. And I started thinking, well, the thing that really got me going was I was thinking of my mentor who had died from MIT, a guy named Michael Drutuzos, and he had started the Lab for Computer Science. And when I was sitting at his office one day in 1987, he said, now just be really quiet, Larry. And the curtains were all closed, and it was the middle of the day over in Kendall Square. And he goes, curtains open. And the curtains went like this, and I was like, wow. That is just too cool. And then he introduced the Bakers, and of course, and then I'm looking at my 2-year-old granddaughter, and she doesn't have a clue, but she's already holding the remote controls, for the curtains, and she's holding,
Probably showing you
voice
how.
things, yeah, kind of thing. So I wanted to write a book that respected technology, that shows that there was a reason to be optimistic about technology, and that it isn't that technical, even though it is, and that, this is a time like the original Age of Reason where technology has matured so much that should start intersecting. And I believe it's a horizontal as well as a vertical, and that we should focus now on excellence in technology in agriculture, in healthcare, in education, and that needs to be where the energy needs to flow. And we could solve so many problems and issues. And I'd rather hear from my guests, but the thing I've learned when we wrote this book was was about climate, where you guys are spending a lot of time. I thought we were going to discover the Amazon of climate, that is working, and it just doesn't exist. There's just dozens and dozens of small climate tech sort of, I can take the plastic out of the ocean, or I can do this, or I can do that. But there wasn't, that. And it was interesting that it was David that said, when we were talking about the future of tech and climate, that he thought maybe a company like Microsoft would become, sort of the Amazon of climate technology, which is an interesting thing if you start to think of technology becoming more generic and more buried and more things. And anyways, and I guess got so excited about my lifetime of technology, also leading up to, I'll always remember moments like when 2007, when Steve Jobs, if you all remember, when he was coming across that stage, and I had remembered speaking with him a few days before that, but he turned to the audience with the first iPhone, and he said, "Don't you get it?" And it's three things in one, and it's a computer, and it's a telephone, and it's a camera, and it was just, those stories just started bouncing around in my head. So that's why I wrote the book, and I hope people will be optimistic. Yes, there needs to be guardrails, and we actually, the UK and Europe are a little better ahead of us at the guardrail stuff, but I do cover that. But I'm hugely optimistic that if CEOs and the C-levels get together, that we can solve a lot of problems. The last thing I'll say, and then we should move on, is that I do think companies should have chief ethics officers, and I do believe in the moral corporation, and that's why I think it's part of marketing, because if you do that, then all you have to do is tell your story, and customers will go, yeah.
And we can help them with that,
You
right?
can totally help them with that.
And so technology is technical, certainly, but David, you wrote an inspirational foreword for Larry's book. Can you tell us what...
I was inspired by him.
Oh, that's good. By each other. Can you tell us what sparked that inspiration, and then maybe what some of the instances in your storied career where technology has inspired you?
Well, thank you. I feel that I have, in some fundamental way, been inspired by technology from the beginning. Although it's ironic, I started covering tech in 1991 when I was at Fortune because, believe it or not, no one else was willing to do it. Because at that time, it was seen as really uncool and boring and technical, and I wasn't particularly eager to do it then either. But the interesting thing about that moment in time is that was like the dawn of the internet, which very few people, even me, had really identified yet. But getting in at that moment turned out to be the perfect moment to become inspired, really. And I was. But I have a few thoughts about what Larry said, if I could. You know, first of all, we absolutely do need guardrails. And it's not like the U.S. is laying down completely on the job. If you look at the court decision about Google this week, that is a historic development that has been long overdue in some respects. I'm not positive it's the right decision, but it is good to put the fear of God into these companies because they have gotten too big and powerful. That is a given. On the other hand, they also bring the world extraordinary benefits, and balancing those two things is extremely challenging. So guardrails are critical, and I wrote a book about Facebook, which you didn't mention, and one of the key things in my sort of genesis and evolution in the last decade or so is having written a book that started out of my excitement about Facebook, which I became familiar with in 2006. Then watching it continue to do a lot of the great things that I identified, but also omitting the guardrails so willfully that massive harms accompanied the benefits because of willful disregard for anything but profit. That would be my summary. And I still think that company has a lot of great things they do for the world. Everyone in this room uses it in various ways, but I suspect, but indisputably, there are massive harms, particularly in political realm and geopolitical, social, you know, the emotional lives of younger people, etc. Interesting. He said a bunch of things that's prompted thoughts. So if you don't, you know, this idea of which I did say that Microsoft could be the Amazon of climate, it isn't happening right now because they're so drunk on the AI thing that they've gotten off track. And I think Microsoft was kind of heading a little bit in that direction because by far more than any other large company in the world, they have done more consciously to try to address climate issues in a non-climate company and given opportunity and tools for other companies. But at the moment, they're in this race that is kind of insanely distracting. And maybe it will ultimately turn back toward societal purposes more clearly. But all that behind me, one of the things I like most about Larry's book is this point, which people don't see often enough, that it isn't just that something like AI is a spectacular innovation that is going to allow all kinds of new stuff. It's that we have evolution of technologies happening in parallel realms, like biotech, where the intersection of, say, CRISPR and AI is going to allow combinational opportunities that are almost inconceivably exciting. And it's really happening, and it's happening in so many realms. You know, and even dumb things that people don't talk about that much that I find interesting, like the Internet of Things, right, which isn't even used as a term these days very much. But I like to think of it as an instrumented society. It is happening because computation is so cheap and communications are so effective and efficient. We are putting data measurement all across the systems of society. That becomes a data landscape on top of which AI can extraordinarily advance societal benefit. So that's where I get excited.
Yeah, and there's an interconnectedness there as well.
Yeah, that's
right?
And there's plenty of other things, you know, quantum computing. There's so many things that are happening, you know, some slower, some faster. And you know, in my current work, one of the things that's really a main focus is that how disastrous as the global climate situation is, and it is truly disastrous, and we will all suffer, us much, much less than the 4 billion people in poorer countries who are struggling to even, you know, just get by. They will truly suffer. But in the end, I think we'll get a handle on it. Too late, because technology will allow a speed of response that most people are underestimating.
Well, we're going to take it around to more of the cool factor and the positive side of some of this technology. And Alexander is an industry professional and an academic who specializes in so many interdisciplinary fields. How have you witnessed the tech utilized for positive purposes?
Yeah, no, so thank you for the question. I think it's really interesting to draw out some different pieces here, right? I'm obviously younger than these two gentlemen, right? What? My experience
you're a lot younger.
My experience with the web, right, is I remember in 3rd grade going to the library in elementary school and trying to connect to the internet. That was the first point of it, and it was an interesting piece. And this was, you know, mid-90s. And then for Facebook, we were the first generation of folks who we got our college acceptance letters, and that meant that we could make a Facebook account.
Oh, okay. Now I know how old you are.
Yeah, now you know how old I am, because it's a very specific point in time. But I grew up with some of these different pieces. And at Solve, what we're looking at is this whole wave, and our job is to find, select, and support people from around the world who are doing high-impact work using technology and are doing it from different contexts around the world where they're doing the deployment. They're thinking about what problems matter for their communities. So let me give you some examples there, because we work in all of the different domains that Larry and David have mentioned. We have teams that are using, to come to, you know, the global south and people who are going to suffer under climate. We have teams that are using AI to do smart greenhouses in Kenya. They've got about 40,000 deployed. They can do plant monitoring. They can improve the yields by a lot. They can improve farmer incomes by a lot. And they can also reduce the insurance premiums because they have a lot more control over the setting. We have teams that are in Brazil that are using GIS, so like remote sensing, and some robotics to help improve acai harvesting. How many people have had an acai bowl in the last few months? But having better acai harvesting means that community incomes go up and they don't have to look at cutting down the Amazon. So it's a way of avoiding deforestation using technology. We have teams that we have a team in Egypt that's doing teleradiology. So they're using generative AI, using the data set for folks in Egypt or in Sudan to look at diagnosing cancer, even when they don't have easy access to radiologists in their local town. That dramatically improves health outcomes. It means that we can get better diagnostics, right? That's a use of AI in some different ways that is adapted to that context. And then maybe in the US front, we all are familiar that AI can do it a lot with language, but we're also familiar with it sucking up a lot of data into kind of black holes. We have a team called the Waukesha AI Consortium that's working on what's called polysynthetic indigenous languages that are structured really differently than how we talk. And they're working on making AI that can process, use, help teach people those languages without losing the data sovereignty for the tribes and peoples that own them. And so we can look at people who are using technology in lots of different ways and thinking about both the deployment of it, because it's not just folks sitting at MIT coming up with new thoughts on how to do these pieces. It's thinking about what is the context where it's sitting in, about the atoms as well as the bits, which is often the much more complicated, how do we actually put this out and have people use it? But also that these innovations are coming from lots of places around the world, but they're not necessarily getting the spotlight. So my job is to go find them, give them a spotlight, use MIT's branded network, right? We can talk a little about the obligations of a university in that sense, and help them get the capital, the advice, the other pieces so that they can go to scale and their impact can show what it means to take technology and use it as a way to dramatically decrease the cost, the effort involved in meeting the big goals that we all share, right? Equity gaps in health or learning or economic prosperity, all of the pieces around climate. How do we mitigate faster? How do we help communities adapt? How do we build resilience? And I think overall, right, Dave and I are both wearing these SDG pins, which is the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, right? 17 big goals: zero hunger, climate action, life on land, sustainable consumption and production. They're big. We know that from some reports, right, there's about a $2.3 trillion annual funding gap for that. Does anyone have $2.3 trillion sitting around? I don't. We know that to get to those goals, we're going to need to reduce the cost of getting there. And we know that technology is a key way of doing that. And we also know that the people who are going to implement those technologies and show what it means are going to come from lots of places. And finally, to loop back to the marketing piece, we know that it's going to take a whole set of partners to get there, but that when we do that, that gives us those really genuine stories for that kind of moral corporation to say, look, we're doing these different pieces. We're also working with these communities to scale up, and these innovators to scale up the really important pieces that give us new business lines and also give us really genuine stories to talk about. So that's my job. I can give you stories all day about some of these cool factors, but
I know I've heard some of them, and I think they're very cool stories. I actually love your job. So. And you talked a little bit about the obligations. So I do believe that there's obligations on organizations like MIT Solve that are going to help some of those smaller companies to bring their technology to fruition. But there's also obligations on business, and even some of the, when they're not drunk, Microsoft, and companies like Microsoft to actually also help as well. Larry, you had been quoted about saying on this book that it's for young people to take to their bosses and their boards. And so why do you feel like many of our young tech-savvy generation that are here should be a target for the book, even though they are already digital natives?
Well, because I think a lot of the CEOs that I met over the time of my generation weren't thinking about innovation in a bigger way. And I think this younger generation has to understand that technology is an evolution and that a lot of it's been baked now that can actually help you make money, but at the same time do good things. So I wanted to give context to a younger C-level, young men and women that are, starting their leadership in companies, that they can have a moral purpose to what they do while they make money. And that's why I was hoping that they would read the book. So.
Yeah, we all encourage that. In fact, David, as a keen industry watcher for over 40 years and somebody who has written a book about Facebook, how have the narratives in technology storytelling changed over the years?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think the idealism quotient has diminished quite dramatically, actually. It was a magical moment when the internet arose, and you might hope that the moment we're in with the extraordinary developments around AI in particular would bring along with it a comparable idealism, but it has not. So that's an interesting thing to observe that I just said to myself for the first time. So I never thought of that before, but I think it is true. The issue of wealth also has so distorted the technology narrative, I think, to a toxic degree, because now the richest people in the world are the most successful technologists, with the one exception of Bernard Arnault and Zara guy and a few others. But basically, it's the Magnificent Seven and their founders are the richest people in the world, which and with inequality being so central of a global problem, that undermines the tech narrative in itself. And it's very connected to what I said before about Facebook and Meta having disregarded the guardrails. They did it in order for Zuckerberg to be worth 150 billion or whatever he's worth. Maybe it's more. I don't know. That's the ballpark. 150 billion for Zuckerberg. That's ridiculous. I mean, come on. So this is one thing I think is kind of cool. If we should have a wealth tax. And if the things keep going in this beautiful direction they've started going in the last few weeks, that might not be an inconceivable possibility. We also need a carbon tax, and there's a lot of clever ways for that to happen through border adjustments and stuff, and I think that will happen. But the tech narrative is not fundamentally as positive as it should be because of the wealth thing. I'd say that probably is the single biggest reason. Because, this is where Larry's book is so right. And I do still believe, despite all that the single thing that people, and especially young people, are so pessimistic and doomerist And many of them, I had a 32-year-old employee when I was running Techonomy who didn't want to have children because she thought the world was so fucked up. Forgive me for speaking badly. But it's not seeing the opportunity that tech, among other things, but tech is so central to the potential of much more rapid progress, but it's not given. We have to believe in it and we have to work for it. It's not like techno-determinism where, oh yeah, well, just leave Zuckerberg and, Satya Nadella alone and Tim Cook and we'll have a beautiful world. No, it is not like that. Everybody has to see it and everybody has to work toward it. And the kind of thing that Alexander's doing is such a beautiful example of doing that, really trying to methodically draw out the good and make it happen faster. It needs to happen much faster.
Yeah, and we also need to see it. We tell our clients at Racepoint Global that we need to show versus tell, right? Yeah. We need to be able to show that they are making a difference, not just the speeds and feeds of technology, but also show us what the good that it is.
Well, I'll just add a small thing there. You need a lot of leadership, and we're not building the narratives that could be built. Example would be Amazon, right, where they have pushed the envelope on technology of drones, all right, and to more than almost any company. Why aren't those drone armies available for the fires in California to bring in, supplies, to bring in things? So those kinds of examples of advanced technologies that have been committed to by the very successful technology giants. Why isn't that done? Google, it's funny, I was telling Hiawatha before when he just came in, and he wrote in today's paper, even though it was posted a while ago, about the Google, monopoly. But when we were researching this book, it was funny, Laura and I would almost to the T, every exceptional technologist we spoke to said Google holds all the cards. We kept going, what do you mean they hold all the cards? And it'd be like, they have the generative AI, they have predictive AI, which is going to be the next sexy thing next year, but before we get to quantum, right? And then they could tell, and I remember when we worked for the Page Family Foundation for a while, the weird thing was Lucy Page wanted to get rid of the flu for some reason, and it was, the odd things. But, the data that Google has, when all of a sudden people are asking in a San Diego County about these symptoms that we're all having together, and the power of the data that they started to create, that is so amazing. All that stuff needs to be told, and it has to be used for the betterment of society, and that this technology did make you very rich, but it also helped you make all these discoveries so that could be used in other ways, and that's what I think is so important.
Yeah, no, we see that a lot. So one piece is we have a lot of data. We have a team that's based in India that has health data for about 50 million people. They're now working with Google to pair that with climate data, so that the different authorities for the different states can make better public health decisions based on when you're going to get heat waves and who's at risk and how you deploy different pieces. So examples of stories that could be told there. I think the other aspect in that same area, and coming back to one of the points from David, where companies have goals, and they've had goals in the past, and I think increasingly, right, what the narrative shift has been is that the goals are not as important as what you've done. Right? It's not about saying, oh, we're going to be carbon neutral at some point. It's what have we done in the last year, the last 2 years that puts carbon in the ground, in the case of Microsoft, and moves in those different directions. And I think there's so much that what we see is people who have made lots of money now asking this question of, okay, how do we give back effectively? How do we put these resources, or companies asking, how do we put money towards high impact pieces? I think that's the other spot where Solve plays a role, right, is helping both build the pipeline and help people understand the whole myriad set of problems that are out there. Where is technology the right piece for high impact? Where are you going to have impact on a system? And helping people explore some.
And how do you keep moving it forward versus, right, in the chapter 2, I talked to an old friend, a physician named Catherine Moore, and Catherine started a company called Da Vinci Systems in Silicon Valley, and she was a pioneer in robotic surgery, which sounds like an oxymoron, but you
Done a
know,
challenge there too.
yeah. But that's how do you push that envelope beyond just creating perfect way for a robot to take out a gallbladder?
Yep.
You know, how do you push that to help eyesight in Africa where you don't have surgeons?
Well,
regular
that's
or
exactly
things?
it. Like, how do you take this robotic or teleoperated robots, and how do you build the training systems and ability so that you can deploy them in much more low resource settings? We did a challenge on that a few years ago.
Yes.
That's been in deployment for a few years now with teams. That was specifically the piece on, okay, here's a really cool technology. Here's some contexts that really need that technology. How are you going to put those two different pieces together? And put a few $1 million towards doing the training, doing not just the technology, but also the training work for the people involved in the systems.
By the way, I do have to that point, I want to say also, almost to the T also, every expert I spoke to said technology cannot do things without human, human,
Humans in the loop.
yeah, completely in the loop and right next to it. And they used a word, adjacency, all the time. Was the word that I kept coming out from Dr. Moore and others, where it was all about adjacency to new innovations in technology. So,
Could I ask him a question?
Yes, you can.
You talk about the moral corporation, and they are in short supply, despite the fact that it's a good idea. And I think the thing I'm curious for your opinion on, which you don't really address in the book, is the role of the investment community in undermining that opportunity, which I see as, look, I am a capitalist, reluctantly, I suppose, but you look, for example, and the thing that's very visible to me right now is this pushback against so-called ESG, right? And in fact, I was just talking to somebody yesterday who's very conversant with a lot of big CEOs, and CEOs of big companies are more willing to move on climate right now than they feel comfortable doing because they're afraid of being sued by investors. And I'm just curious, and that's a grotesque example, but then there's just the sheer reality that, say in a case like Facebook, they make more money if they just let Zuckerberg, open the gates and let it all hang out. How do you square that?
well, I think more optimistically about the CEOs. So I try to not. First of all, my last book, Authentic Marketing, started with after I talked with Black from Larry Fink from Blackstone, who set a rule. Here's the largest investment company in the world, arguably, and he said we're not going to invest in companies that don't have some element of morality around doing social good or something. So there are investment people that do understand something about the moral corporation.
He has backed off from that somewhat.
He has backed off a bit, all right. But that's what I think, you should. The other thing that I talk to CEOs about in a positive way is why they should be pressing more with ESG is that one of the biggest problems they're going to face, all right, in the future is the word talent. And to attract talent, they're going to have to be a good company. So whether they believe it or not, they're going to have to be more competitive, that a competitive advantage for a company today is people. And then the use of technology with those people. And that's what's going to create a common good, in my opinion. So, yeah, I mean, Esther Dyson's in the book, an old friend of ours, but sometimes she comes across as almost communist, that everything's too equal. And, it's just not. There's a reason we're in a capitalist society. It is a race, for innovation and winning, but also how do you attract more talent? How do you attract people? We have a client that's a large agricultural company that's in the first part of the book, and I remember its former CEO was really mad one day. The only time he called me out of the blue, his name is Sam Allen, and he ran John Deere for a number of years. And I'm going, I wonder what he's mad about. Maybe there was a bad headline that we were responsible for, or something like that. And he was mad because a number of young engineers from Purdue, where he had gone to school, had turned his offers down, or Deere's offer, not his, but Deere, to become an engineer at John Deere, because they went to Google, or they went to Meta, or they went like that. So to the point of how do you create, because there is exciting engineering work to be done in agriculture, and it's like, how do you make that passionate and tell that story and create that? And so there's a CEO that got it, and he...
Can I give you a contrary example?
Sure.
Danone, which is a great company, we all buy their
The yogurt company.
It's a huge, huge food company. They were really aggressive on climate-related innovation and working with the Environmental Defense Fund. And the CEO got kicked out because of investor activism, saying you're not making enough money. So,
which is too bad.
It's a problem. It's a needle.
I think it's interesting to watch two different trends there. One, I think the talent point is absolutely right. It's part of some of this generation and watching the next set of people they're going to lose those opportunities. Though I think, yes, people underestimate how interesting the problems are at Deere, at any number of different companies that are doing physical work in a lot of cases, right? The challenges of how do you put the offshore wind turbines in is a fascinating set of logistical and engineering challenges that is every inch as interesting as how do we build a slightly more accurate ad targeting algorithm. But the other piece, the other force is I think materiality is shifting on some of those shareholders' pieces too on climate, right? That if Danone is not active on climate, they're going to be at risk for regulatory pieces in the EU, and
have trouble hiring.
And they're going to have trouble hiring. And I think, but I think that twin piece of you're going to have problems hiring, and there's going to be more and more materiality on and business risk if you're not paying attention to climate. At a minimum, making sure your facilities are adapted, right? And that can lead to some really nasty visions, right? Exxon putting in seawalls around its facilities in Louisiana to stop itself from being affected by the sea level rise that they've helped create. We can leave those ones aside. But I think it's implicit on all companies then they're looking at these different spaces where not just the EU, but countries around the world are saying, look, we're going to hold you responsible for climate damages at some level, or you're just going to be exposed to climate damage and you're going to have a hard time operating because floods are going to take out all the infrastructure around your plant. And so that puts pressure, I think, even on the shareholder side to say, hey, what are you doing here? Let alone things like SEC disclosure rules or other pieces that might be coming.
But this is why we need things like carbon pricing, because it starts to force all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And it is happening in many parts of the world, and it will happen eventually.
And it will happen, and I think alongside that, what we've seen a lot of is companies who say, okay, we admit that there are some things we should do here. We don't know actually how to get there. And that's where, coming back to how do we find the innovations, how do we figure out how we use these technologies to solve the problems that companies are facing in ways that let those scale, that end up having very large, impacts as a result. And then how do we find those tools, and how do we do it fast, right? That question of speed and speed to scale.
And speaking of that speed and scale, we've talked a lot about challenges. We've talked a lot about some of the issues. What are the technologies, or what are the areas in which of industry, whether it's education, whether it is climate, is it in healthcare, that need the most help right now, and maybe the shareholders don't know about them yet? So in your technology realm, what are some of the things that we may not be hearing about yet? And then we might take some questions from the audience.
Well, look, I was remiss not to mention Newbar, who spent so much time with us one day, who started Flagship Pioneering here, he just kept calling, all he kept talking about was great leaps. But you talk about the investment community, once Moderna came out with that vaccine so quickly, and there weren't a lot of complaints.
Which was started by Flagship, that company. Yeah.
Right, but there weren't a lot of complaints about that. But I think the whole health area is huge. When we were looking, I just think there's so much immense cross-fertilization that, and I think the Gates Foundation, who has its critics, but it's has done well in that, using a lot of that innovation across that has Newbar, who has 82 companies now,
Yep.
in flagship.
He's built a stunning venture studio in that sense, and
man.
thinking about the combination of things too, right?
Yeah.
And then there's other companies kind of thinking about the Kendall area, like Inari, which is putting that AI and CRISPR together to make better seeds, right? So things that have just very specific approaches of how do we put these different pieces together. In terms of that question on like what do we see that needs help, I think the healthcare space, because there's going to be so much opportunity with the tech, we see lots of it around Cambridge and spreading out to other towns around. But also, how do you make sure that what you come up with is equitably available to people, right? That it doesn't end up just being available to the upper 5% of the US, much less the upper 1% of the world, right? And how do we think about deployment, and how do we use technology to bring those costs down in a way that solves those equity gaps? I think also on the education front, another space that the Gates Foundation is doing a lot on is ed tech, right? People have been trying to put technology into classrooms for decades. It hasn't gone great in a lot of cases for a lot of different reasons, right? It's hard. Teaching is a hard profession. Teachers do not have a lot of time for different spaces. Thinking about whether technology is actually helping or hurting is a hard question. And in a lot of cases, it seems to be a distraction. But there are opportunities with generative AI to change whether students have to take tests in English, whether we have to do time-bound tests. We're just finished up and announced some winners on a challenge with the Gates Foundation on using generative AI to improve K-8 learning assessment, right? And so thinking about how we can change how we understand what students have learned in ways that are way more comfortable for them and way more accurate, and also helping teachers have resources continuously to make sure that they can target support in a way that doesn't take away from their time that they have a limited resource for as well. And I think, the final space, coming to climate, there is so much on climate that needs to be worked on, and there is so much that is happening. Climate is always just a piece of overwhelm. I think it's easy to get overwhelmed and feel like it's too late. I would encourage everyone in this room to not feel that way, because we know that even though we had started maybe a decade later than we would like to, right, with Paris, with all the commitments that have come out of that, we know that we've reduced the likely rise in temperatures from absolutely apocalyptic, 3 to 4 degrees. It's down to 2.7. We know that it can go lower and probably head towards 2 with a pretty clear path with what countries have committed to so far. We know that the drop in pricing on wind and solar by 80 to 90%, the continuous drop in batteries, that's unlocked a whole new set of innovation that basically says, okay, if renewables are just ridiculously cheap, and the biggest problem we have is that they're actually too cheap to operate a bunch of the time, right? There's too much solar on the California grid, so we actually want to turn some of it off. That provides a whole new pile of opportunities where, okay, we have really cheap electricity sometimes. What can we use that excess electricity to do? Is it storage is it turning it into other chemicals? Is it all of a sudden we can do different things to make steel and concrete because we can use different chemical processes that just happen to be really energy intensive? Turns out that doesn't matter if the energy is just freely available and curtailed. But there's also still this question of how do you build a future where we don't just take the US and we decarbonize it in Europe, but we also build the entire global South where living standards have gotten much better, right? We can see all sorts of huge improvements in quality of life over the past few decades. But we know that we need to build a system that is not slightly better than where people are. We need to ensure that everyone has access to some degree, a lot more energy services, but also, right, this dream of, let's say Wakanda, right? How do we make sure that everyone has great housing, has great access to energy, and how do we do it in a way that avoids the fossil path that the US and the EU took, because it's cheaper and it's better to just skip that. That's a really cool opportunity to push at. It gives us so many cool pieces. And the final piece that I'll flag here is the way that we get there, and a lot for all of these cases, is that we need to have stories of the worlds that we want to live in, and we need to talk about that. So if you take away one piece, and this is all your jobs in lots of cases, it's telling stories of a better future that look at pieces today and talk about the things that we want to see, not just the things that we want to avoid. And I can give you lots of suggestions on where to look for that inspiration.
And we did have some sunny days in Ireland. Our tent trip was not completely a wash. Do we have any questions from the audience that would like to chime in on? Yes, Faith.
So you talked a little bit at the beginning of the discussion about guardrails for AI. And then you have the big companies like Facebook that are going to be able to continue to push the boundaries with their army of lawyers. no matter what those guardrails are. How do we ensure that, whatever guardrails or regulations that are in place are not stifling the innovation of smaller companies who don't have those resources at their disposal, but they are the ones that are perhaps doing the most good in the world?
I don't know, these guys probably know more than I, but in the book I talk about the UK is actually way ahead of a lot of us in guardrails. I don't think it's a government solution. At least in my lifetime, every time the U.S. government tried to get involved in controlling technologies, it was just a disaster, And so I think it's more, I was so impressed with Christine, what was her last name, Laura? What? Montgomery, who's the head lawyer and in charge of guardrails at IBM, and what she was doing. And she started a whole group of like-minded people, mostly in big companies, but she included small companies as well for the creation of their own guardrails, so establishing their own discipline around that. And I think that's the only way it's going to happen, is if companies get together and work toward, controlling a more moral use of these technologies and where we go. And I think that will waterfall down to smaller companies. But if you get the government involved, even just 18 months ago, your friend Zuckerberg is in front of the Senate, and the Senate's calling it the Facebook. That's what it was called in 2004. So you're like, really? They're going to give regulations? So.
David, you want to address that? The question is how will ethics or putting guardrails in will not stifle innovation?
It's a really tough question, and I don't really have a good answer. But one thing that I will observe, and this is why I expressed some ambivalence about this recent legal ruling against Google, it's very similar to when antitrust action took place against Microsoft, in that, Microsoft, they came down on Microsoft just when Linux was coming up anyway. And Linux was a fundamental threat to a lot of things Microsoft was doing, and they ended up just embracing it and buying GitHub and all this amazing stuff. But, generative, it's funny because they're talking about how in the remedies for the Google antitrust, they were going to try to figure out how to keep it from dominating AI search, that's AI-based, which they don't really need to do, because there's so many AI-based search technology companies that are going to be emerging. Google's going to be on the defensive anyway on that. So it's like, as Larry said, they're too late. And the EU has done a much better job of coming in earlier, even on something like GDPR, which has a lot of flaws, but they did do something smart earlier. It's partly because the government there takes it as part of their responsibility to understand technology, and they have a huge whole division of the European Commission that just studies technology, which the US government does not have. So I wish I knew the answer to the question, which is a very sensitive one. But I want to make a related point that to a bunch of communicators. To me, one of the central stories that is not told enough is the value of cooperation and the power that even for-profit, hardcore capitalist companies get when they work across disciplines, with partners, with NGOs, with government. When all these players come together, you can think of these stories in the micro and the macro. Sometimes it's just two companies working together. But that narrative of cooperation is so needed, and it's so central to what is going to lead to all the kinds of progress we want. And again, it's undermined by the narrative of you become Elon Musk by being an asshole, and you don't ever work with anybody, and you just tell everybody to go screw themselves, and then you become the richest man in the world. And that is really a toxic contrary to what we really need. So, and it's also related to another part of the narrative of tech that's changed, is that, technology used to be a very ideals-driven thing. It was very liberal. These people that Larry came up with, all of them, Mitch Kapoor, these are like hardcore, practically leftists who ended up being capitalists, right? And now you have Thiel and Musk and Palmer Luckey and even Zuckerberg praising Trump and the idea that, oh, well, the thing to do is to get rich and then give your money away, not let government have it. Well, these are really dangerous ideas.
Yeah. Which is why we have to have books like Larry's that talk about the tech for good side of things.
Well, a positive spin on that was more promotion of like a company like ARM, which people forget about.
Right,
But
great story.
Yeah, but here's something that understood the power of ecosystems, and that's not talked about enough. And that a little semiconductor company from Cambridge, England, could beat Intel, who is an amazing company, but beat them to the punch on a lower battery, lower power, architected semiconductor for the smartphone. Yeah. And that was all not just because of them, but it was because they were part of an ecosystem of numerous technology innovations. And it was just so powerful. And that's why, as much as I respect Intel, they have to come back now from that kind of...
They couldn't work well with others.
Yeah.
That's really true.
And it really was, because my first book that nobody read was about those leaders, and that the subtitle of the provocateur was A Generation of Leaders That Are Building Communities, Not Just Companies. So, and that's what we need to get back to a little more, of that sharing of things. Eventually, you want to be the competitor that wins, but how do you have some kind of common use? Anyway, is there any more questions so that we don't, Brian? Oh, okay.
You talked a lot about, AI and climate change. And I'm just curious, as you look towards the future, where do you think the biggest advancements will come from in technology to help fight climate change?
So the question being the biggest advancements in technology to help fight climate change.
Could I take
David,
a shot at
you can
that?
take
Because
that.
when you ask what are we excited about that people don't think about so much, it's very connected to that, in my opinion, where I come from. The ability of AI to optimize efficiency across domains, especially in the energy system, is so underappreciated. And I'll give you a specific example which might turn out to be the Amazon of climate tech, and that is Octopus Energy. If anyone is familiar with it, it's the biggest utility in the UK. It's a startup. It uses AI to optimize consumer energy use, but they also own wind turbines and all kinds of things. And they are coming into the United States, which is much harder because we have such a screwed up utility regulatory landscape. But in countries where utilities are less highly regulated, AI is quickly beginning to be a tool for efficiency that's going to help with climate, because efficiency is what you need. Because this is the problem. I was thinking when Alexander was talking, we have all these great technologies that are coming along so fast, but the world's population is still growing quickly. And when it comes to climate, we are increasing our use of energy dramatically, even as we're trying to switch to renewable sources, which makes it triply hard to move quickly enough.
Yeah. There was one more question in the back.
Brian?
Thank you.
It's actually related to that, which is how, Dave, if you could say more, you could see Microsoft specifically potentially become, I think that was mentioned earlier, the Amazon for climate, because there's something counterintuitive to that, which is also something what you just said, which is they're using more energy in data centers and places that seem to be counter to.
Okay, well, I'll give you a quick, if you think about this point I made earlier about an instrumented society, right? Data's everywhere. Microsoft is the operating system company. What we really need is an operating system for the global economy. That is not an exaggeration. Now, that's really inconceivable in some respects, but if Microsoft were to think of itself, and I think there are people there who do think in these terms, in terms of how do you take their systems approach to technology management to an even larger scale of economic systems, there is a gigantic opportunity there. And Octopus, the company I mentioned before, is thinking in those terms. So energy is the biggest problem, but it's not the only problem. And I believe we can, with AI, build systems that integrate our management of energy with our use of energy, with all kinds of manufacturing technologies, this is getting into a fairly spacey realm, which I don't want to try to push too hard, but I think there's a possible way of thinking bigger about the challenge, which again comes to a cooperative, collaborative thinking about the economy that Microsoft is almost uniquely positioned to advance into if they chose.
I would worry a little bit about some of those pieces.
I would worry about it too, because it's not easy.
But I think, no, it's an interesting piece.
Could it happen? Could that ever
I
happen?
think it seems very plausible.
Does that include putting Wi-Fi in tents as well, just so I can let
I
Ellen
mean, I
know?
think this idea of like, how do you have information everywhere? You know,
Right.
you jest a little bit, but I think this question of how do we have information available everywhere so that you have sensors in lots of places, the Internet of Things aspect, so that we can look at what how the different data systems or different buildings in our cities are operating, whether it's to manage flooding, whether it's to manage heat, whether it's to manage, you know, access to information on global spending. I think there's all sorts of cases there where, yeah, you should have a Wi-Fi in the tents, even though we might also want to work on how do we help all of us disconnect from our devices when we go camping.
Perhaps.
It's a
I'll send her
different
to
thing.
MIT to learn that part,
My
Alexander.
5-year-old is also very interested in having Wi-Fi in her tent.
We are going to take one more question, then we're going to ask Larry about his next book.
Perfect.
David, you've mentioned billionaires a few times. I've read recently how Bill Gates is trying to bring nuclear power back. There's a group of Silicon Valley billionaires who have bought farmland in California, trying to build their dream city. What's the balance between risk versus reward when you have a handful of people who are basically experimenting with endless budget?
Are you kidding? Oh my God, that's such a complex and good question.
with the time that we have
The
left.
thing is, I mean, we have, the weird thing is, as a society, we have let ourselves get into the position where that question has to be answered because such an incredibly disproportionate amount of societal wealth is controlled by a very small number of individuals, which is just intrinsically unhealthy. I don't care how great the Gates Foundation is, which it is. It is the biggest foundation in America. It's the most effective in many ways, but it shouldn't have, it really shouldn't be a one-man operation.
Well, it's become another multilateral development agency, right? Like it has that same
It's that
stature.
scale, well, which is great, and it's beautiful that he, that this predatory monopolist changed his stripes late in life. But that's true. He was a predatory monopolist, and he realized, I should do some nice stuff. And now even Zuckerberg is getting interested in climate, which is good. But I do think a wealth tax, I mean, it's almost an answer to your question. Biden wants to put that in. He said if he was reelected, he would do that. Now, we're not going to get that opportunity, but I think the same policies could potentially be implemented. So maybe that's a form of answer.
I'll say, to add to that, there are enough problems for everybody. It's kind of generally what I'll say is would I like more money and some of the billionaires' money to be going to slightly different things? Sure. Do I think that we need a lot of experiments to figure out what's going to be most effective and to, in some cases, to try some very high-risk stuff? I think fusion is an example there. Yes, like fusion is a really nice case. MIT does some things on fusion. I don't do anything with fusion, but I can have some stuff on nuclear. I don't plan for fusion, right? I plan for a world that runs on wind and solar and batteries because we know how to do those at very cheap scale. They're the cheapest thing everywhere, and we can build those out in lots of spaces. We're starting to get to the point where we can build them out faster than we need energy, and so that we actually see, the net addition starts to shift. It's slow. Still building a lot of coal plants in a lot of places. But if fusion were to show up, right, if we were to get some of these different plants to work, that would be great. So do I mind if some billionaires put some, millions and billions of dollars towards doing something that would be really high risk but really high reward? No. But it's a case of how do we make sure that we're not shortchanging the stuff that we need to do for deployment for everything else at the price of that. And that's where, they have outsized power in the system. And how do we manage that?
I want to make one final comment from me that's oddly optimistic in a very surprising way. Look at China and look at some of the things that are happening there in an economy which is a command and control economy where these system problems are not allowed and using brutal force in some cases to emerge. Do you know that I just saw a statistic yesterday, EV sales in China are now more than half of all vehicle sales? It's less than 10% in the United States. So, isn't that right? I think China is doing so many of the right things in so many domains. And for example, on fusion, right, which the US could never get enough government money to, and so Commonwealth, which is an MI, it's really funded by rich people, right? But in China, they just put $2 billion into a fusion startup, but with the government, it could be that China as a global model, which is a competition with us all the time and don't think anything else, everybody in Bangladesh and the Congo is looking at these two models all the time and saying, which one should I follow? China may be working better.
Well, and right, climate is a global problem. If China solves some things and gets to deploy it everywhere, that's a benefit for everybody. Sorry, let's ask Larry about
That's okay. I was going to say on an oddly optimistic end note, thank you. David, I will say that I'm in jest said Larry's next book. I wish we could solve all of the world's problems here this morning, or maybe even Ella's with her tent. We'll get back to that one later. But some just parting comments from you, Larry, in addition to buying the book. What would you like to leave us with?
No, I thank you for coming, and I think of technology as a wonder is what I would say. That you should look at it that way, not in something that's going to tear down or bring down, or look at it wonder. Or in my favorite title for anybody's job is a friend named Mitch Resnick, who's been at the Media Lab for years, and his title is the manager of lifelong kindergarten. So I think looking at the world as a joyous possible place, and that technology can help solve problems, I think is really good. And I'm just going to focus on this book for now. I'm going to go back, if I do another book, I'm going to go back to my career And I'm toying around with a book called The Last Pitch, so that you don't have to pitch communications anymore. It just happens. So anyway, thank you all for caring about this, and thank you for coming. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.